Dust settles over blood-soaked floorboards. Shadows creep across broken glass, hiding a man holding cold iron. 6 outlaws lie dead. Silence reigns supreme until heavy leather strikes pine. Footsteps echo. 1, 2, 3. Terror grips survivors huddled under splintered tables. He claims no identity, carries no badge, possessing just a smoking barrel and relentless purpose. Lawmen call him a ghost. Whiskey drunks whisper his legend in hushed tones. Tonight, hell comes to Oakhaven. Fear tastes like copper. Death wears a wide-brimmed hat. Anyone standing in his path faces a terrible reckoning. Counting begins again. 4, 5, 6. The year was 1883, and the town of Oakhaven, Nevada, was a monument to stolen wealth and buried sins. It did not grow from honest sweat or the slow, steady progress of pioneers. It erupted from the earth like a festering wound, funded by silver and sustained by fear. The man holding the leash to this wretched piece of the frontier was Josiah Sterling. Sterling was a baron of industry, in tailored wool and imported silk, a man who built his empire not just on the backs of the desperate, but on the graves of the defiant. He owned the bank, the trading post, the livery, and most importantly, the law. Oakhaven existed in a state of perpetually held breath. The local enforcers, a gang of deputized cutthroats led by a mountain of a man named Thaddeus Boone, ensured that Sterling's tax was collected and his authority remained unquestioned. Just 3 weeks prior, Elias Miller, an honest rancher with a stubborn streak, had refused to sell his water rights to Sterling's mining company. In the dead of night, Boone and his men visited the Miller spread. By dawn, the ranch house was a smoldering ruin of black ash and charred timber. Elias and his wife were inside. The town looked away, burying their heads in their watered-down whiskey and their silent prayers, hoping the beast that ruled Oakhaven would not turn its gaze upon them next. It was on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, when the wind was choking on red dust, that the Nameless Gunman arrived. He did not ride in on a white stallion, nor did he announce his presence. He simply appeared on the eastern ridge, a silhouette cutting through the heat distortion. He rode a roan gelding that looked as road-weary and scarred as the man sitting atop it. The stranger wore a canvas duster coated in layers of alkali dust, a faded Stetson pulled low over his brow, and a bandana pulled up just enough to obscure the line of his jaw. As his horse plodded down the main thoroughfare, the rhythmic clink-clank of his Mexican silver spurs seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the town. Blacksmiths paused their hammers. Women hurried their children off the boardwalks. Men playing checkers on the porch of the general store stopped mid-move. There was something profoundly unsettling about the way the stranger moved, or rather, the way he didn't. He sat perfectly still in the saddle, his hands resting lightly on the pommel, his eyes hidden in shadow. He didn't tie his horse at the livery or the hotel. He rode straight to the center of town, stopping in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, Josiah Sterling's prized establishment and the unofficial headquarters of Thaddeus Boone's violent crew. The stranger dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy, final thud. He stood there for a long moment, brushing the dust from his duster, revealing the worn leather of his gun belt. The holster sat low on his right thigh, tied down with a rawhide thong. The grip of his revolver was a dark, polished walnut, completely devoid of the ornate carvings or pearl handles favored by cheap showmen. It was a tool of ugly, practical work. He took a step toward the saloon doors. The wood groaned under his weight. Those who were watching felt a cold dread settle in their stomachs. In the Wild West, survival often meant knowing when a storm was about to break, and looking at the broad-shouldered silhouette standing before the swinging doors, the town of Oakhaven knew a hurricane had just made landfall. Inside the Silver Dollar, the air was thick with the stench of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap cigar smoke. The player piano in the corner banged out a discordant tune, trying in vain to mask the grunts of the gamblers and the hollow laughter of the saloon girls. Clementine Ford, a tough-as-nails bartender who had seen more men die over cards than she cared to remember, was polishing a shot glass when the swinging doors parted. The sunlight from the street pierced the gloom for a second, framing the stranger. The saloon, usually a hive of raucous noise, fell into a sudden, uneasy hush. The piano player's fingers fumbled, hitting a sour chord before trailing off entirely. Sitting at a prime table near the back were Rufus and Cole, two of Boone's most vicious deputies. They were playing faro, their tin badges gleaming against their greasy shirts. Cole had a reputation for shooting men in the back, and Rufus was known to use a skinning knife when bullets felt too impersonal. The stranger walked toward the bar. His heavy boots pounded against the wooden floorboards. Thud, clink, thud, clink. It was a slow, deliberate march. He stopped directly in front of Clementine, his face still hidden by the brim of his hat and the shadows of the room. "Whiskey?" Clementine asked, her voice tight, betraying her practiced composure. The stranger didn't answer. He reached into the pocket of his duster. Rufus and Cole, sensing a shift in the room's pressure, pushed their chairs back slightly, their hands hovering near their irons. The stranger withdrew his hand and placed a single object on the scarred mahogany of the bar. It wasn't gold dust or a paper bill. It was a silver dollar, but it was severely warped, blackened by intense heat, and partially melted on one side. Clementine stared at the ruined coin. "We don't take damage tender, mister." "It's not for a drink," the stranger said. His voice was like grinding stones, deep and rough, a sound scraped from the bottom of a dry well. "It's for Josiah Sterling. Tell him his debt has come due." At the mention of the boss's name, Cole kicked his chair out from under him and stood up. "Hey, Drifter," Cole spat, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "You got a lot of nerve walking in here, throwing trash on the bar, and saying, 'Mr. Sterling owes you anything.' You don't know who you're talking to." The stranger did not turn around. He didn't even shift his weight. He kept his gaze fixed on the mirror behind the bar, looking at the distorted reflections of the two deputies behind him. "One," the stranger said. The word hung in the air, a bizarre non sequitur that confused the room. Rufus stood up now, drawing his skinning knife with his left hand, while his right hand hovered over his revolver. "You deaf boy? My friend is talking to you. Turn around and state your business before we drag you out to the hanging tree." "Two," the stranger said, his voice completely flat, devoid of anger or fear. "That's it. I'm putting a hole in this son of a bitch," Cole snarled, drawing his weapon. The movement was a blur, a trick of the eye that the human brain could barely register. The stranger didn't spin. He pivoted on his heel, dropping his right shoulder as his hand whipped down to his thigh. By the time Cole's pistol cleared leather, the stranger's revolver had already cleared its holster, leveled, and fired. Bang! The deafening roar of the shot shook the dust from the rafters. Cole was thrown backward, a perfect, bloody hole right between his eyes. He crashed into the faro table, sending cards and chips scattering across the floor. Rufus let out a roar of rage and lunged, raising his pistol, but the stranger was already in motion. He didn't fan the hammer like a reckless cowboy. He cocked it with his thumb in a precise, fluid motion. Bang! The second shot caught Rufus in the throat. The deputy dropped his gun, clutching his neck as bright crimson sprayed over the nearest patrons. He gurgled, stumbling backward before collapsing over Cole's lifeless legs. The saloon was plunged into pandemonium. Women screamed, men dove under tables, and glass shattered as people scrambled for the back exits. The stranger stood calmly in the swirling gun smoke. He slowly lowered his revolver, but he did not holster it. He walked over to where the two bodies lay. The terrified patrons parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against the walls. The stranger looked down at the dead men, then kicked Cole's discarded tin badge across the floor. He turned back to Clementine, who was frozen behind the bar, her hands trembling violently. "Tell Sterling," the stranger repeated, the metallic click of his revolver cylinder echoing as he casually reloaded 2 fresh cartridges. 3. He turned and walked out through the swinging doors, leaving the saloon in a state of traumatized paralysis. Sheriff Amos Reed was a man drowning in a sea of compromise. He sat in his office down the street, nursing a bottle of rye and a blinding headache. There was a time, long before he pinned a tin star to his chest in Oakhaven, when Reed believed in the sanctity of the law. Now, he was just an overpaid janitor who swept Josiah Sterling's messes under the rug. He knew about the Miller Ranch. He knew about the extortions. He knew, but the silver Sterling paid him was heavy, and the fear of Thaddeus Boone was heavier. When the 2 gunshots echoed down the street, Reed jumped, knocking his whiskey bottle over. It rolled off the desk, shattering on the floor. He cursed, grabbed his Winchester rifle, and sprinted out the door toward the silver dollar. By the time he arrived, the stranger was gone. The street was empty, the dust settling back into the ruts. Reed pushed through the saloon doors, his rifle raised. The smell of copper blood and harsh cordite hit him like a physical blow. He found Clementine sitting on the floor behind the bar, hyperventilating. He saw the bodies of Rufus and Cole tangled in a heap of broken wood and playing cards. "What happened here?" Reed demanded, lowering his rifle. "Who did this?" A drifter, a patron, stammered from beneath a billiards table. "Just a guy in a duster." He shot him. Cole drew first, but the stranger was faster than the devil himself. Amos. Reed walked over to the bodies. 2 shots, 2 kills. Perfect accuracy. This wasn't a drunken brawl, this was an execution by a professional. "Did he say anything?" Reed asked, looking at Clementine. Clementine pointed a shaking finger at the bar. He said to tell Sterling his debt was due. And he left that. Reed walked over to the bar. He picked up the warped, blackened silver dollar. As he turned it over in his palm, feeling the melted edge and seeing the specific minting mark through the soot, the blood drained from his face. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. Suddenly, the sweltering heat of the saloon felt like a meat locker. His vision blurred, and the sounds of the crying saloon girls faded into a ringing in his ears. 1,878. The memory hit him with the force of a runaway train. 5 years ago, before Oakhaven was a booming town, before Sterling was a baron, there was a Union Pacific gold transport moving through the treacherous Blackwood Pass. No, the canyon, he corrected himself, a nameless ravine out in the desert. 6 men had planned the heist. Josiah Sterling was the mastermind. Thaddeus Boone was the muscle. Amos Reed was the inside man, providing the route. 2 other hired guns made up the crew. But there was a 6th man. A man they had recruited for his unparalleled skill with a horse and a rifle. A man whose real name they never bothered to learn, who just went by the Rider. The heist had been successful. The gold was secured, but Sterling didn't want to split the take 6 ways. Reed remembered the betrayal vividly. It happened at their desert camp. Boone had shot the Rider in the back. As the man bled out in the dirt, Sterling ordered them to throw him into the transport wagon they had used for the getaway, and they set it on fire. They watched the wagon burn to ashes, leaving the man to a horrific fate, ensuring no loose ends remained. That stolen gold was the foundation of Sterling's empire, the seed money that built Oakhaven. And the payload they had stolen that night? It wasn't just gold bullion, it was a shipment of freshly minted, uncirculated silver dollars. Reed stared at the burned coin in his trembling hand. A man burned alive in a wagon doesn't walk into a saloon 5 years later. It was impossible. "Amos?" Clementine asked, noticing the sheer terror etched into the sheriff's face. "Amos, what is it? Who was he?" Reed looked toward the swinging doors, out into the blinding glare of the street. The stranger had killed 2 men. Then he had said the number 3. He wasn't counting victims. He was counting down. 5 men betrayed him. 2 of the original crew, the hired guns who had helped burn him, had recently become deputies under Boone, Rufus, and Cole. "He's not a drifter," Reed whispered, his voice cracking with a fear he hadn't felt in half a decade. He slipped the blackened coin into his pocket, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. "He's a ghost. And he's coming for the rest of us." Reed realized, with a sickening plummet in his stomach, that the Nameless Gunman hadn't just come to exact revenge on Josiah Sterling. The man was systematically dismantling the empire, starting from the bottom, working his way up the bloody ladder of their past. Rufus and Cole were numbers 1 and 2. Sheriff Amos Reed swallowed hard, looking at his own reflection in the cracked mirror behind the bar. He was number 3. Josiah Sterling did not sweat. It was a point of pride for the Baron of Oakhaven. While the laborers in his silver mines choked on stagnant air and the ranch hands baked beneath the Nevada sun, Sterling remained ensconced in his hilltop mansion, surrounded by imported Persian rugs and the cool breeze flowing through large glass-paned windows. He was a man who believed that wealth elevated a person above the physical miseries of the frontier. He was currently reviewing a ledger of exorbitant loan interests when the heavy oak doors of his study slammed open. Sheriff Amos Reed stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his face the color of spoiled milk. Sweat poured down Reed's forehead, stinging his eyes and soaking the collar of his faded blue shirt. Behind him, the massive frame of Thaddeus Boone filled the hallway, his face a mask of irritated stone. Boone had practically dragged the hysterical lawman up the hill. "Josiah," Reed gasped, clutching the doorframe as if the earth were tilting beneath his boots. "He's back. God help us, he's alive." Sterling closed his leather-bound ledger with a sharp, decisive snap. He steepled his manicured fingers and looked at the sheriff with the same disdain he reserved for a beggar. "Get a hold of yourself, Amos. You are wearing a badge, for heaven's sake." "What are you babbling about?" Boone stepped into the room, his heavy spurs ringing against the hardwood floor. He was a brute of a man, scarred from a dozen knife fights, with cold, dead eyes that had witnessed and caused unspeakable cruelties. "Rufus and Cole are dead. Boss. Shot down in the Silver Dollar in broad daylight. Witness says a drifter walked in, provoked him, and put him down faster than a rattler strike. Didn't even take a scratch." Sterling frowned, tapping his index finger against his lips. Losing Rufus and Cole was an inconvenience, not a tragedy. They were blunt instruments, easily replaced with other desperate men looking for a paycheck. A fast gun looking to make a reputation, Sterling dismissed smoothly. Hang him from the livery rafters before sundown. Set an example. "It ain't a random drifter, Josiah," Reed yelled, his voice cracking hysterically. He stumbled forward, reaching into his pocket with trembling fingers. He slammed the object onto Sterling's immaculate mahogany desk. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. The warped, blackened silver dollar sat on the polished wood like a curse. Sterling's tapping finger froze. For the first time in 5 years, the temperature in the opulent room seemed to plummet. He stared at the ruined coin, the melted edge, the scorch marks permanently tattooed into the silver. A suffocating silence stretched across the study, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Where did you get this?" Sterling asked, his voice dropping an octave, the polished veneer cracking just a fraction to reveal the ruthless outlaw beneath. "He left it on the bar," Reed whimpered, practically collapsing into a leather armchair. "He told Clementine to tell you that your debt is due." And he counted. "Josiah. He shot Rufus, then Cole, and he said 3. He's counting us down. The men from the canyon. He's coming for me next." "Impossible," Boone rumbled, stepping closer to inspect the coin, his brow furrowing in deep disbelief. "I shot the man myself. Square in the spine. He was bleeding out before we even threw him in the wagon. Then we lit it up with kerosene. Nobody survives an inferno like that. You saw the ashes, Amos. You saw the bones. Then who walked into that saloon?" Reed shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the coin. "Who shoots with that kind of ungodly speed? You know how good he was. He was the devil with a Colt, and now he's come back from hell to collect his due." Sterling stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He refused to be intimidated by a ghost story. He was a man of power, a man of tangible assets. Dead men do not walk, Amos. They do not drink, and they do not shoot. Someone survived. A witness from the canyon, perhaps, or someone who found the wreckage and figured out what happened. A blackmailer with a fast draw, nothing more. "You didn't see the bodies, Josiah," Reed argued, burying his face in his hands. "Right between the eyes. Center of the throat. Flawless. It's him. I know it." "Shut your mouth," Boone snapped, backhanding Reed across the face. The sharp crack echoed in the room, and Reed tumbled out of the chair, nursing a bloody lip. "You're acting like a spooked horse. If it is him, he breathes air and bleeds blood, just like anyone else. And if he comes up this hill, I'll put a bullet in his skull this time, instead of his back." Sterling walked around the desk, looking down at the cowering sheriff. "Boone is right. We control this town. We have 30 armed men on the payroll. This Avenger is severely outnumbered. Boone, lock down Oakhaven, post men on the rooftops, at the edge of town, and heavily guard the bank. Shoot anyone wearing a duster on sight. And Amos," Reed looked up, blood trickling down his chin, his eyes wide with desperate hope that Sterling would offer him sanctuary in the mansion. Go back to your office, Sterling commanded coldly. Do your job. If you show this cowardice to the town, they will riot. Be the sheriff I pay you to be. Reed stared at the Baron, a cold realization washing over him. Sterling didn't care if Reed lived or died. To Sterling, the sheriff was just bait. If the gunman came for Reed, Boone's men would have an opportunity to ambush him. He was being sacrificed. Without a word, Reed scrambled to his feet. He wiped the blood from his mouth, nodded once, and stumbled out of the study. He didn't go to rally the deputies. He didn't go to patrol the streets. He went straight to his office, his mind racing with only one thought: survival. He locked the heavy wooden door of the sheriff's station, pulling the iron deadbolt shut with a clank that sounded far too fragile. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody streaks of orange and red across the dusty floorboards. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and contort. Reed went to his desk, pulling the bottom drawer completely out to reveal a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was a leather saddlebag, stuffed tightly with paper notes and gold double eagles, his cut of the extortion money, saved for a rainy day. Well, the flood had arrived. He slung the heavy bag over his shoulder. He grabbed a box of Winchester ammunition, shoving handfuls into his pockets. He checked the cylinder of his revolver 3 times, his hands shaking so violently he dropped 2 bullets onto the floor. He couldn't take a horse from the main livery. Boone's men would be watching, but he kept a private, fast roan in a small, dilapidated barn behind the jailhouse. If he could just make it to the barn, he could ride south into the desert under the cover of darkness. He would disappear into Mexico. Let Sterling and Boone face the wrath of the ghost they created. Night descended on Oakhaven like a heavy wool blanket. The town, usually alive with music and drunken brawls, was deathly silent. Everyone had heard the whispers of the bloodbath at the Silver Dollar. Doors were barred, shutters were nailed shut. Even the stray dogs seemed to know that death was walking the streets. Reed blew out the oil lamp on his desk. He took a deep breath, the stale air doing nothing to calm his racing heart. He unlocked the back door, wincing at the loud squeal of the hinges, and stepped out into the cool, dark alleyway. The journey to the small barn was only 50 yards, but to Amos Reed, it felt like crossing a barren desert. He hugged the shadows of the buildings, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The wind howled through the gaps between the structures, a mournful sound that sounded entirely too much like a dying man's last breath. He reached the barn door, his hands slick with sweat against the rough wood. He pulled it open, slipping inside the pitch-black interior. The familiar, comforting smell of hay, leather, and horse manure washed over him. His roan horse whinnied softly in the dark. "Easy, girl," Reed whispered, blindly reaching out to find the stall. We're leaving right now." He found the saddle and hefted it onto the horse's back, fumbling with the girth strap in the dark. He was almost done. He was almost free. The heavy leather satchel of money bumped reassuringly against his hip. Then he heard it. Thud. Clink. The sound came from the front of the barn. Slow, deliberate. The heavy strike of a leather boot followed by the metallic chime of a Mexican silver spur. Reed froze, the breath trapped in his lungs. The horse shifted uneasily, sensing the sudden spike of absolute terror emanating from the man beside her. Thud. Clink. The footsteps were inside the barn. The darkness inside the barn was absolute, save for a few slivers of pale moonlight slicing through the gaps in the shingled roof. Amos Reed pressed his back against the wooden partition of the horse stall, his hand gripped so tightly around the handle of his revolver that his knuckles ached. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom, but he saw only shapes and shifting shadows. Today. Too. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was the agonizing weight of a condemned man standing over the trap door, waiting for the lever to be pulled. Amos. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a raspy, damaged whisper, the sound of dried leaves dragging across a gravestone. It carried no anger, no malice, only the terrifying weight of inevitability. "Who's there?" Reed yelled, his voice cracking, aiming his gun blindly into the dark. "Show yourself. I'm the law in this town. I have 30 deputies outside, and if I fire this gun, they'll descend on this barn like a plague of locusts." A low, dry chuckle echoed from the rafters. There is no law here, Amos. Only ledgers, and yours is deep in the red. Stay back, Reed screamed, panic entirely consuming him. He pointed his revolver at a shadow near the feed barrels and pulled the trigger. Bang! The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the barn in a strobe light burst of yellow. The bullet splintered a wooden post, sending a shower of splinters into the air. The horse reared up, kicking the stall door in fright. The flash faded, plunging the barn back into pitch blackness. You missed, Amos, just like you missed your chance to walk away 5 years ago. The voice was closer now. To his left. Reed spun, firing again. Bang! The flash illuminated nothing but empty air and floating dust motes. He fired a third time. Bang! He was shooting at ghosts, wasting his ammunition in a blind frenzy. I didn't have a choice, Reed cried out, tears streaming down his face, dropping the pretense of ignorance. Sterling planned it. He said if we didn't go along with burning the wagon, he'd put us in it with you. I was just a guide. I didn't pull the trigger. Boone shot you. Boone did it. But you struck the match, didn't you, Amos? The voice was directly behind him. Reed screamed and whirled around, raising his gun, but a heavy, gloved hand shot out of the darkness and gripped his wrist like an iron vise. The sheer strength of the grip crushed the bones in Reed's hand. He howled in agony, his fingers popping open involuntarily. His revolver clattered to the dirt floor. A match flared to life, a sudden, blinding point of fire in the dark. The stranger stood mere inches away. The flickering light of the match illuminated the lower half of his face beneath the brim of his hat. It was a ruin of puckered, twisted scar tissue. The flesh melted and fused in a horrific testament to surviving a furnace. The skin on his jaw and neck was a mottled landscape of burn scars, pale and shiny in the matchlight. But his eyes, visible just beneath the hat's shadow, were clear, cold, and utterly dead. Reed stared into the eyes of the man he had helped murder. His knees gave out, but the iron grip on his wrist held him up, dangling him like a rag doll. I'm sorry, Reed sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound. He tried to offer the satchel of money. Take it. Take the gold. It's thousands. You can start over. Go anywhere. Buy a ranch. Just please don't burn me. I beg of you, don't burn me. The stranger let the match burn down until the flame licked the leather of his glove. He didn't flinch. He simply blew it out, plunging them back into the abyss. I don't want your gold, Amos, the rough voice whispered in the dark, right next to Reed's ear. I want what was taken from me. 5 minutes of my life. The 5 minutes I spent screaming while my skin boiled and you rode away. The stranger let go of Reed's crushed wrist. Reed collapsed into the dirt, sobbing uncontrollably, curling into a fetal position, waiting for the splash of kerosene. He waited for the agonizing heat. Instead, he heard the familiar, mechanical click-clack of a Colt single-action revolver cocking. I am not like you, Amos, the stranger said softly. I don't burn men alive. Reed looked up into the darkness, a sliver of confusing hope piercing his terror. The muzzle flash erupted from a foot away. The bullet struck Amos Reed squarely in the center of his chest, shattering his sternum and tearing through his heart. The impact threw him backward against the wooden slats of the stall. He slid down to the dirt floor, his hands twitching, his lungs trying to draw breath that would never come. The satchel of money spilled open beside him, scattering gold double eagles into the blood-soaked dirt. The stranger stood over the dying sheriff, watching as the frantic light faded from Reed's eyes. He slowly lowered the smoking barrel of his gun. He did not touch the scattered gold. He didn't even look at it. He uncocked the hammer and slid the revolver back into his worn leather holster with a smooth, practiced motion. The town of Oakhaven was still silent outside. The gunshot had been muffled by the thick walls of the barn, but even if someone had heard it, no one was brave enough to investigate. Boone's men were patrolling the main street, completely unaware that their sheriff lay dead 50 yards away. The stranger turned on his heel. His boots struck the dirt floor as he walked out of the stall. Thud. He paused at the barn door, looking out toward the hilltop where Josiah Sterling's mansion blazed with electric light, a beacon of arrogance and stolen wealth, standing defiant against the dark night. Clink. The stranger adjusted the brim of his hat, letting the shadows swallow his ruined face once more. He stepped out into the cold desert wind, his path set, his vengeance only half complete. 4. He whispered to the empty alleyway. The rising sun did not bring light to Oakhaven. It only painted the dust the color of dried blood. Morning revealed the true extent of the town's paralysis. The boardwalks were utterly deserted. The general store remained padlocked. The only movement came from the anxious, twitching hands of Thaddeus Boone's deputies, who were stationed on rooftops and balconies with lever-action rifles, scanning the empty streets for a ghost. Boone himself discovered what remained of Sheriff Amos Reed. The giant of a man kicked open the heavy barn door, a sawed-off shotgun resting casually over his massive shoulder. He found the sheriff slumped against the stall, his dead eyes staring blankly at the rafters. Boone did not mourn his comrade. His gaze immediately locked onto the leather satchel and the scattered gold double eagles gleaming in the dirt. A cruel, cynical smirk twisted Boone's lips. Reed had been running. The coward had tried to flee like a whipped cur and had caught a bullet for his trouble. Boone crouched, his thick fingers scooping up the bloody gold coins and shoving them into his own deep pockets. He grabbed the satchel, heavier by several $1,000s, and stood back up. "Should have stood your ground, Amos," Boone muttered to the corpse. He stepped out of the barn and looked toward the center of town. The Oakhaven Bank and Trust, a sturdy structure built of red brick and reinforced steel, sat like a fortress at the end of the main thoroughfare. Boone decided then and there to consolidate his power. He marched to the bank, kicked the tellers out into the street, and commandeered the building. He stationed his 3 most ruthless remaining deputies: Virgil, a scarred rustler from Texas; Caldwell, an ex-cavalry sharpshooter; and Emmett, a younger man whose cruelty was born of fear rather than malice, inside the lobby with him. "Nobody gets within 50 yards of this door," Boone ordered, slamming a heavy wooden desk across the entryway as a barricade. "You see a shadow move, you put lead in it. Sterling wants the man dead, but I want him in pieces." The wait was agonizing. The suffocating heat of the Nevada afternoon baked the town, creating shimmering mirages over the dirt road. The deputies sweated through their woolen shirts, their nerves stretched taut. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window panes, caused them to jump. Then, the psychological warfare began. It started with Caldwell. The sharpshooter had been stationed on the flat roof of the telegraph office across the street, providing overwatch for the bank. At exactly high noon, when the sun was directly overhead and shadows were shortest, the deputies inside the bank heard a strange, heavy thud from outside. Virgil peeked through the slats of the window blinds. His face went chalk white. "Boone, you need to see this." Boone shoved Virgil aside and looked out. Lying in the center of the dusty street, baking in the sun, was Caldwell. His rifle was gone. His throat was a mess of crimson. Pinned to his chest with his own deputy's badge was a single, heavily burnt matchstick. The message was clear. The high ground belonged to the dead. How did he get up there? Emmett panicked, backing away from the window. "There's no stairs on the outside." Caldwell would have seen him coming. "Shut up," Boone growled, though a cold bead of sweat finally rolled down his thick neck. "He's just a man trying to get in our heads." An hour later, the telegraph wires on the pole outside snapped with a loud twang, whipping through the air and coiling onto the street like dead snakes. Oakhaven was officially cut off from the rest of the world. They could not wire for a federal marshal or a Pinkerton agent. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. By mid-afternoon, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, deliberate sound that had preceded the carnage at the Silver Dollar. Thud, clink, thud, clink. The heavy strike of boots and the chime of Mexican silver spurs echoed down the empty street. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. The acoustics of the wooden buildings bounced the sound around, making it seem as if the Nameless Gunman was walking on the roofs, in the alleyways, and right behind them all at once. Emmett finally broke. The young deputy dropped his Winchester, his hands trembling violently. "I ain't dying for Josiah Sterling's old sins," he stammered, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "I didn't burn nobody. I wasn't there." "Pick up that rifle, boy," Boone ordered, racking his shotgun. "You walk out that door. I'll shoot you myself." "I'll take my chances with you, Thaddeus," Emmett cried. He scrambled over the barricaded desk, threw open the heavy bank doors, and sprinted blindly down the street, waiting for the crack of a rifle from the shadows. Boone raised his shotgun, aiming squarely at the fleeing deputy's back, but before he could pull the trigger, a gunshot rang out. It didn't hit Emmett. The bullet struck the iron barrel of Boone's shotgun, ricocheting with a high-pitched whine and nearly tearing the weapon from the giant's hands. Boone stumbled back, cursing, shaking his numb fingers. He looked out the open door. Emmett was gone, having scrambled safely into an alley. The nameless gunman had spared him. He wasn't killing indiscriminately. He was a surgeon, methodically cutting out the diseased flesh of the men who had betrayed him, and Thaddeus Boone was next on the operating table. Pride and rage finally eclipsed Thaddeus Boone's paranoia. He realized that cowering behind a mahogany desk in a bank lobby was a death sentence. The ghost wasn't going to charge the front door. He was going to pick them apart, piece by piece, until Boone was driven mad. "Virgil," Boone spat, picking up his scattergun and checking the twin loads of buckshot. "Cover the flanks. I'm going out there. I put this dog down 5 years ago. I'll do it again." Boone kicked the desk aside and marched out of the Oakhaven Bank, his heavy boots pounding the boardwalk. He stepped down into the dusty street, a colossal monument to brute force. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the storefronts. "Show yourself, you burnt piece of trash," Boone roared, his voice echoing like thunder off the facades of the buildings. "You want your due? Come get it. I'm standing right here." A fierce gust of wind blew through the street, kicking up a miniature dust devil that swirled dried tumbleweeds and discarded paper. Out of the swirling red dust, 50 feet down the avenue, a silhouette solidified. The nameless gunman stood perfectly still. The canvas duster billowed around his knees. The dark walnut grip of his Colt rested against his thigh. He did not speak. He did not posture. The utter stillness of him was more terrifying than any battle cry. Boone didn't wait for a dramatic draw. He wasn't a duelist. He was an executioner. He raised the double-barreled shotgun, aimed at the center of the gunman's chest, and pulled the front trigger. The roar was deafening. A cloud of lead shot tore through the air, completely shredding a wooden water trough that had been standing just to the gunman's left. Water exploded in a geyser of splinters and foam, but the gunman was no longer there. At the exact moment Boone pulled the trigger, the stranger had dropped low and lunged to the side with unnatural speed. From a kneeling position, he drew his Colt, cocked it, and fired in one fluid, blurred motion. The bullet tore through the meaty part of Boone's left shoulder. The giant grunted, stumbling backward, dropping the shotgun from his suddenly useless left hand. But Boone was a man built of tough gristle and mean bone. Ignoring the blood pouring down his sleeve, he drew his own heavy Caldwell revolver from his hip with his right hand and charged. He fired wildly as he ran, the heavy bullets kicking up geysers of dirt around the gunman. The stranger didn't retreat. He stood up, calmly thumbing back the hammer of his Colt, and fired again. Bang! The bullet struck Boone in the right thigh, shattering the femur. Boone roared in agony, crashing to his knees in the middle of the street. The heavy revolver slipped from his grasp, landing in the dirt. He tried to reach for it, clawing at the earth like a wounded bear, but a heavy boot clamped down on his wrist, pinning his hand to the ground. Boone looked up, gasping for air, the fight finally draining out of his massive frame. The nameless gunman towered over him. The sun was directly behind the stranger's head, casting his face in deep, impenetrable shadow, but Boone could see the horrific edges of the melted, scarred flesh along his jawline. "You," Boone coughed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "I shot you in the spine. You shouldn't be walking." "I crawled, Thaddeus," the rough, scraping voice replied. "For 2 miles across the desert sand, I crawled while my flesh peeled off and the smoke filled my lungs. I survived on rattlesnake meat and puddle water until a Navajo medicine man found me. He gave me back my legs, but he couldn't give me back my face or my life." "Go to hell," Boone spat, a bloody glob landing on the toe of the gunman's boot. "I've been there," the stranger said softly. "It's entirely too crowded. So I came back." The gunman pressed the barrel of his Colt directly against Thaddeus Boone's forehead. The cold iron left a perfect ring in the dust and sweat on the giant's brow. Boone squeezed his eyes shut, his massive chest heaving. He waited for the blast. He waited for the dark. "Say it," the stranger demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Say the number, Thaddeus. Acknowledge the ledger." Boone's jaw clenched. Even in the face of death, the brute's pride flared. But the cold pressure of the gun barrel and the inescapable truth of what he had done in that desert canyon 5 years ago broke his iron will. He had stolen the gold. He had pulled the trigger. He had struck the match. 4, Boone rasped, a final defeated breath. Bang! The sound echoed through the desolate town, rolling up the hill toward the opulent mansion where Josiah Sterling sat, waiting. The giant of Oakhaven collapsed face first into the dirt, dead before his massive bulk hit the ground. The nameless gunman slowly holstered his weapon. He did not look back at the terrified deputy, Virgil, who had watched the entire execution from the window of the bank and was currently scrambling out the back door to flee into the desert. The stranger stepped over Thaddeus Boone's corpse. He raised his head, looking up the winding dirt road toward the grand estate on the hill. The electric lights of the mansion flickered against the twilight, a beacon of stolen silver and blood-soaked gold. 4 men down, 4 debts paid in lead and blood. He began to walk up the hill. Thud. Clink. The final reckoning for Josiah Sterling had arrived, and the nameless gunman was coming to collect. Josiah Sterling paced the length of his mahogany-paneled study, the thick Persian rugs muffling his frantic footsteps. The echoes of the shotgun blast and the answering pistol shot from the town below had faded, replaced by an agonizing, suffocating silence. He had watched through his brass spyglass as Thaddeus Boone, his invincible titan, fell dead in the dirt. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's blade, finally pierced Sterling's aristocratic armor. He was completely isolated. The telegraph wires were dead. His army of deputies had either fled into the Nevada desert or lay bleeding in the streets of Oakhaven. Desperation drove him to his massive desk. He pulled out a piece of heavy parchment and began to write frantically, dipping a gold-nibbed pen into an inkwell. He was drafting a plea to William Pinkerton of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in Chicago. Sterling promised astronomical sums, crates of Wells Fargo gold, mining shares, whatever it took for an army of operatives to march on Oakhaven and exterminate the ghost haunting him. He wrote with such ferocity that the nib tore through the paper, splattering black ink across the polished wood. It was a futile gesture. A letter would take days to reach a train, let alone Chicago, but writing it was the only thing keeping Sterling tethered to sanity. Suddenly, the electric lights in the mansion flickered. The glass bulbs hummed, flared brightly for a fraction of a second, and then died completely. Sterling froze, his pen hovering over the ruined parchment. The study was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight spilling through the grand bay windows. The generator out back, a noisy, coal-fed beast that powered Sterling's lavish lifestyle, had abruptly ground to a halt. He was not entirely unguarded. Sterling retained 2 elite bodyguards, twin brothers named Wyatt and Morgan, who had once ridden with ruthless border militias. They were stationed in the grand foyer at the bottom of the spiraling oak staircase, armed with repeating rifles. "Wyatt! Morgan!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual refined cadence. "Report." Only silence answered him. No boots on the hardwood, no reassuring shout from the foyer. Sterling yanked open the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a silver-plated derringer, a gentleman's weapon, woefully inadequate against a man who had dismantled Oakhaven's deadliest killers. He gripped it with trembling hands and crept toward the heavy oak doors of his study. He pressed his ear against the wood, straining to hear anything over the frantic drumming of his own heart. A liquid, heavy dripping sound echoed from the hallway outside. Drip, drip, drip. Then came the sound that Josiah Sterling had been dreading for 5 long years. Thud. Clink. Thud. Clink. The heavy leather boot and the Mexican silver spur. The footsteps were slow, unhurried, ascending the grand staircase with terrifying deliberation. They did not pause. They did not rush. They moved with the unstoppable momentum of a ticking clock winding down to 0. Sterling backed away from the door, raising his tiny pistol. He bumped into his desk, knocking the inkwell to the floor, where it shattered, pooling black across the imported rug like a shadow bleeding into reality. The footsteps reached the second-floor landing. They turned down the hallway. Tood. Clink. They stopped directly outside the study doors. Sterling stopped breathing. He aimed the derringer at the brass handles, his knuckles white. "I have a fortune in the floorboards," Sterling screamed, his aristocratic facade crumbling into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Name your price. There is enough gold to buy a county in California. You don't have to do this." The brass handles slowly turned. The heavy oak doors swung inward with a mournful creak, revealing the pitch-black void of the hallway. Standing in the threshold was a towering silhouette. In his left hand, the stranger held Morgan's repeating rifle. In his right, the dark walnut grip of his Colt revolver rested casually against his thigh. He dropped the rifle. It hit the floorboards with a heavy clatter, sliding across the room to bump against Sterling's polished shoes. The rifle's stock was slick with fresh blood. The stranger stepped into the moonlight, filtering through the bay windows. The pale light illuminated the horrific, melted ruin of his jawline, and the pale, dead eyes staring out from beneath the brim of his hat. "There is no price on a man's soul, Josiah," the rough, scraping voice whispered, echoing off the mahogany walls. "And yours was bankrupt the night you struck the match. You survived." Josiah Sterling breathed the words into the oppressive silence of the study, his voice trembling so violently it barely constituted a whisper. He lowered the silver-plated derringer just a fraction, his aristocratic composure entirely shattered by the ghastly, impossible visage standing before him. The arrogance that had built Oakhaven was gone, replaced by the primal, quivering terror of a cornered animal. Blood dripped from the stock of the repeating rifle the stranger had dropped onto the Persian rug. Drip, drip. The sound was deafening. It was Morgan's blood, or perhaps Wyatt's. It did not matter. Sterling's invincible fortress had been breached by a solitary phantom. "We watched the wagon burn to ashes," Sterling stammered, backing away until his spine pressed hard against the massive mahogany desk. He gripped the edge so tightly his knuckles turned a translucent white. "We stood there until the wood collapsed into embers." How were you standing in my home?" The nameless gunman walked slowly into the center of the room. His canvas duster, coated in the pale dust of the street, and the dark splatter of Thaddeus Boone's violent end, brushed against the imported furniture. The Mexican silver spurs chimed their relentless death knell. "The fire burned the man I was," the rough, scraping voice replied. The sound was like two dry stones grinding together, carrying the permanent damage of lungs scorched by kerosene smoke, left his hopes and his mercy dead in the canyon dirt. What crawled out of that smoke wasn't a man anymore, Josiah. It was just a ledger with 5 names written in soot and blood. Cole was 1, Rufus was 2, Amos was 3, Boone was 4. Sterling scrambled behind his desk, frantically seeking refuge behind the heavy oak panels. "Listen to me. I can explain the canyon. It wasn't just about the greed. I know who you really were." The gunman stopped perfectly still. He slowly drew his Colt revolver. The metallic click-clack of the hammer pulling back echoed off the leather-bound books lining the walls. It was the sound of a judge gaveling a final sentence. "I know you weren't just a hired gun," Sterling rambled hysterically, pointing a trembling, ink-stained finger at the stranger. He was desperately trying to rewrite history, trying to find a justification for the cruelty that would somehow spare his life. "I searched your saddlebags before we threw you in the wagon. I found the official papers hidden in the lining. You were a federal agent, an operative sent by the territorial governor, or maybe even William Pinkerton himself, to intercept the transport. You were going to arrest us all. I had to protect my men. I had to protect my future." It was an act of self-defense. A low, hollow chuckle rumbled from the stranger's ruined throat. It was a terrifying sound, completely devoid of warmth or humor. "You flatter yourself, Josiah," the gunman said, stepping into a shaft of moonlight. The pale illumination caught the horrific, melted topography of his jawline and neck flesh that had bubbled and fused together in the inferno. "I was no lawman. Those papers were stripped off a dead United States Marshal in Denver a month prior." A convenient disguise designed to get me close to the transport without raising suspicion from the railroad guards. Sterling's eyes widened, his manicured hands shaking uncontrollably. Then why? Why were you there? We offered you an equal share of the payload. You were the finest shot on the frontier. You could have lived like a king. The stranger took another deliberate step forward. Because the transport wasn't carrying standard silver dollars, Josiah. You were so blinded by your own ambition, so eager to build an empire, that you never looked closely at the foundation you were pouring. What are you talking about? Sterling gasped, his chest heaving. I deposited that silver into the Oakhaven Bank. I traded it for Wells Fargo gold certificates. I bought land, politicians, and railroads. My empire is real. Your empire is a ghost town waiting for the wind. The gunman corrected smoothly, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. The year was 1878. The United States Treasury had just passed the Bland-Allison Act, requiring the government to buy millions of ounces of silver to mint the new Morgan dollars. But a massive forgery syndicate operating out of the Dakota Territory was flooding the Western banks with perfect counterfeits. Secretary of the Treasury John Sherman authorized a trap. Sterling stopped breathing. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a polished marble corpse. The payload moving through that canyon, the gunman continued relentlessly, driving the truth into Sterling's chest like a railroad spike, was a shipment of experimental, uncirculated bait. It wasn't solid silver. It was a core of heavy lead and tin, washed in a microscopic layer of real silver, stamped with intentional, microscopic flaws on the eagle's tail feathers. The government leaked the route, knowing the syndicate or a greedy baron like you would steal it and try to wash it through frontier banks. No, Sterling whimpered, shaking his head side to side. No, the assayers. They tested it. You bribed the assayers in Reno before they ever struck a crucible, the stranger interrupted. You built this mansion, bought those imported rugs, and hired your army of killers using painted tin. You murdered an innocent rancher and his wife over land rights to protect a bank vault full of worthless metal. You burned a man alive for an illusion. The absolute futility of his life's work crashed down upon Josiah Sterling. The revelation was worse than a bullet. He had sacrificed his humanity, condemned his soul, and lived in 5 years of constant, agonizing paranoia, all for a lie engineered by bureaucrats in Washington. They tracked the flawed coins here 3 years ago, the Nameless Gunman said softly. The United States Secret Service knows exactly what Oakhaven is. They know exactly who you are. A cavalry detachment is already 2 days out, riding hard from Fort Laramie. They aren't coming to protect you, Josiah. They're coming to chain you to a federal wagon and hang you for grand treason and counterfeiting. A broken, hysterical sob erupted from Sterling's lips. He looked around his opulent study at the electric lamps that were now dead, at the shattered inkwell staining his expensive rug, at the terrified, pathetic reflection of himself in the bay window. He looked down at the derringer, trembling in his hand. It was a gentleman's weapon, and he was no gentleman. He was a thief who had been outsmarted by a system far larger than his own greed. He would not face the hangman's noose in a dirty public square. He would not let a burned ghost take his final shred of dignity. Sterling raised the tiny, silver-plated pistol. He didn't aim it at the towering silhouette of the gunman. He pressed the short barrel directly against his own temple, closing his eyes tightly to shut out the nightmare his life had become. Before his finger could even tighten on the trigger, the gunman moved. The speed was inhuman, a blinding blur of motion honed by years of obsessive, hate-fueled practice in the unforgiving isolation of the desert wastes. Bang! The heavy, .45 caliber bullet tore through Josiah Sterling's right bicep, shattering the bone into jagged shrapnel and nearly severing the arm entirely. Sterling screamed a high, piercing shriek of absolute agony. The derringer flew across the room, clattering uselessly against the baseboards. The Baron collapsed against his desk, clutching the ruined, spurting stump of his arm, sliding down to his knees in a pool of his own blood and spilled black ink. The gunman walked slowly around the mahogany desk. He towered over the whimpering, broken aristocrat, his shadow swallowing Sterling completely. I told Amos that I was here to collect a debt, the stranger whispered, leaning down until the brim of his hat nearly touched Sterling's sweat-drenched forehead. He pressed the smoking, blistering hot barrel of the Colt directly against the center of Sterling's chest, feeling the frantic, terrified hammering of the man's heart against the iron. "I never said I would let you choose the currency of your payment. You don't get the easy way out." Sterling looked up into the lifeless, dead eyes of his executioner. He didn't see a man anymore. He saw the roaring, unquenchable fire of the canyon, reflected in those dark pupils, an eternal, burning rage that would never be extinguished, a force of nature that cared nothing for wealth or apologies. "5," the Nameless Gunman said softly. Bang! The final shot shattered the suffocating silence of the night. The impact threw Josiah Sterling violently backward. He slammed against the floorboards, his limbs twitching once before settling into absolute stillness. His lifeless eyes stared vacantly up at the ornate plaster ceiling, unseeing, unaware of the empire crumbling around him. The ledger was closed. The count was finished. The Nameless Gunman stood in the dark study for a long time. The deafening ringing in his ears slowly faded, replaced by the howling of the Nevada wind rattling the window panes. He felt no triumphant surge of victory. He felt no sudden peace or resolution. The consuming fire inside him, the singular, driving rage that had sustained his broken body for 5 grueling years, suddenly flickered and died. It left behind only a vast, echoing emptiness, a cold void darker than the desert night. He slowly uncocked the hammer of his revolver and slid it back into the worn leather holster. Reaching into his duster, he withdrew a single sulfur match. He struck it against the polished mahogany of the desk. He held it up, watching the small yellow flame dance and weave, illuminating his severely scarred face in the darkness. He walked over to the heavy, imported velvet drapes covering the Grand Bay windows. He didn't hesitate. He touched the match to the bottom edge of the fabric. The dry velvet caught instantly. The flames raced up the curtains with a ravenous hunger, spreading to the wooden trim and the expensive Persian rugs. He didn't wait to watch the Baron's legacy burn. He turned his back on the growing inferno and walked out of the study, his boots echoing heavily down the grand oak staircase. By the time he rode his scarred roan gelding out of the desolate streets of Oakhaven, the mansion on the hill was a towering pillar of fire, painting the night sky in brilliant, violent strokes of orange and red. The remaining townsfolk, freed from the terror of Thaddeus Boone and the financial grip of their dead master, had finally emerged from their barricaded homes. They stood in the dusty streets, their faces illuminated by the distant blaze, watching the symbol of their oppression turn to ash. None of them saw the man in the canvas duster leave. They only heard the slow, fading rhythm carrying him back into the unforgiving wilderness from whence he came. Thud, clink, thud, clink. A ghost returning to the shadows, leaving nothing but a bloody ledger, a town built on lies, and a trail of smoke in his wake. Thank you for riding with us to the bitter end of this gritty Wild West saga. If the twisted tale of the Nameless Gunman and his relentless countdown kept your heart pounding, show your support by hitting that like button. It lets us know you crave more dark, real-life-inspired frontier drama. What did you think of Josiah Sterling's counterfeit empire and that explosive final confrontation? Let us know in the comments below. We love reading your theories and reactions. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a masterful story of betrayal and cold-blooded vengeance. Most importantly, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming historical thrillers and legendary tales from the dusty trails. Keep your powder dry, watch your back, and we will see you in the next story.